Hello everyone, DonTheCrown here, and today I want to talk real quick about the changes to the Diablo for kind of damage formula, because they've kind of done some massive things and it's kind of made it a little bit more complicated and crazy, but it's pretty simple once you kind of understand what's going on. So before, when you crit a vulnerable enemy, you would get your base damage, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, main stat, and then additive multipliers all kind of multiplied together, and that would give you your damage. Now what they're doing is that when you crit, your crit strike damage isn't really like a multiplier there. No matter how much crit strike damage you have, you're only just going to get an additional 50% damage. And likewise with vulnerable, you're only going to get an additional 20% damage. But that is going to allow crit strike damage and vulnerable damage to go into the additive multipliers, like with all of the other stuff. So like all of the damage versus, all of the damage while, all of the damage with, all of that is going to then just get crit strike damage and vulnerable damage added to it, just like it would if like you had like versus burning or something like that. It's just similar to that. Now this is a huge deal because especially like on my barbarian, I know that if I lost vulnerable on an enemy, I would go from doing like 100% of my damage down to like 20% of my damage. So a large chunk of my damage was coming from getting enemies vulnerable. And so now this is drastically cutting that damage down, which is a big deal for a lot of builds. This can make vulnerable not as important to get on like your builds in general, but you probably will still want it. And there's some easy ways this season to make enemies vulnerable. But it's just going to be massively a huge change to the damage formula. Now to give you an idea kind of what this looks like is this is my item calculator that I've been using in the past. I'll put a link to this in the description below. This is kind of my character from season 2. This is a Sork, so we have like a multiplier here on our critical strike damage. But to give you an idea, we only are having 180% vulnerable damage on this character. If I went out and I got another 180% vulnerable damage, historically, in like season 1, pre-season, this would massively increase my damage. Now it's only going to give me 15% more damage. That's a pretty big nerf. And likewise, if I took that 180% and put that into burning damage, it would still give me the exact same amount, and just assuming that enemies are vulnerable. Now, if you don't have a good way to make enemies vulnerable for whatever reason, then the burning damage is actually going to be more valuable to you than vulnerable. You just kind of want to pick whatever is easy for you to activate and has biggest number type of thing. Now, critical strike damage also is kind of in a tough spot because you also need to crit. So if I put like 180% up here, you notice the number is down. And if my crit strike chance goes down, so does the amount that I'm getting back from this, which is kind of makes crit strike damage bad, especially if you don't have the ability to get a lot of crit, because unless the number is much bigger than the other ones, it's probably better just to take damage versus close as opposed to critical strike damage. Now, these aren't the only things that they've changed with the damage formula, because they've also added multipliers for all of different classes. And these kind of basically take a portion of a stat and make it a multiplier. So hemorrhage, for example, now additionally has bleeding is increased by 15% of your damage to vulnerable. And so if you had like 300% damage to vulnerable, that would mean that you should be getting 45% more damage multiplier, which is pretty big. I've kind of like guesstimated some of these numbers based off of the stats of gear right now. I know that they are reworking gear and they're adding new higher tiers of gear. I think it's going all the way up to like 925. So some of the end game gear is going to be very high stat, I would assume. And so take these with a grain of salt. But here are the different ones that we're going to have. So like Blood Rage, for example, this is going to increase all of your damage based off your damage while berserking for barbarians. I think this is going to be popular. Druid's Paragon, Earth and Devastation. It's going to make it so that Earth skills deal an additional 1.1% critical strike damage. Plus, it's also going to get 25% of your bonus damage versus crowd controlled, but this is capped at 40%. Now, some of these are capped and some of them don't appear to be capped. I'm not really sure why they chose to do it that way, but just how it is. So Thunder Strike, for example, make it so that storm skills deal bonus damage equal to like 50% of your total damage versus close and distant bonuses, which I think is going to be, especially if you're playing a storm skills, you're really going to want to get this and stack this, because this should be a massive multiplier, even more than critting if you have a lot of close and distant, because you can get this on weapon, you get this on ring. I'm sure there's other places you can get this as well, which is going to really make that a powerful multiplier for you. And this is kind of going to be a theme for season 2, is that every class before was stacking critical strike damage, every class was stacking vulnerable. Now each class is going to have kind of their own separate stats they're going to hunt, which I think is somewhat of a step in the right direction, but overall I'm not a big fan of all of these changes. Now I'm not going to go through all of the ones here per se, but these are a whole bunch of different ways that you're going to be multiplying your damage. Now there is a couple of things to note as well. There are a whole bunch of new vampire powers that maybe I should do in a video. I added this to the mega doc. It's down here in these season 2 powers, but things like metamorphosis, for example, are making it so that when you evade, you turn into a cloud of bats and you become unstoppable for 4 seconds. And then enemies along your path take 160% physical damage and are inflicted with vampire curse. Now, this is really important because I'm pretty sure that this is going to add unstoppable basically to every class. This is something that basically everybody's going to want to pick up because it can make you unstoppable, which should get you out of crowd control. And it also applies vampire curse. And vampire curse is pretty important because of Pray the Weak. So what Pray the Weak does, it makes it so that you deal 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. I'm sure that this is a multiplier. And then enemies are vulnerable while they're afflicted by a vampire curse from your other vampire powers. And so you just evade through an enemy, you become unstoppable, and then you apply vampire curse to them, and that makes them vulnerable. And so I think that things like this are really going to kind of shake up the game a little bit. If you're playing a build where you had to really kind of ham fist vulnerable into the build before, this is going to change it quite a bit. There's also some new uniques that are going to be kind of neat. And so this thing here, Tybalt's Will, makes it so that you deal increased damage while you're unstoppable and for 4 seconds afterwards. And when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource. And so, yeah, it's going to be a very interesting pair of pants here, because you'll be able to just kind of spam back all of your resource. And I know that Sorks have that really neat wand that everybody was memeing on before. It's called the Oculus, I believe. And this basically makes it so that you gain the effect of the teleport enchantment, but when you evade using your teleport enchantment, you're taken to a random location, but you're basically able just to spam evade, which, should make you unstoppable, both thanks because to teleport, but also metamorphosis here. If you wanted to do that instead, we would apply vampire curse. These pants would make it so that you are gaining tons of resource every single time you evade. So you could just be dumping out tons of spells, teleporting to somewhere randomly and just dumping out more tons of spells with your primary resources constantly getting filled. And I think there's going to be some really weird builds in D4 Season 2. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below and come by the stream. See ya.